Imagine a ruler so bold, he tried to delete an entire religion. He didn't just defy the gods, he replaced them. This is the real story of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who erased Egypt's ancient gods and almost vanished from history himself. If you're into forbidden history, hidden truth, and ancient drama, hit that subscribe button now, because UTAK Diaries is about to dig up what textbook skipped in the scorching sands of ancient Egypt, where pharaohs were considered living gods and tradition ruled with an iron fist. For over 1,000 years, one man dared to do the unthinkable. His name was Akhenaten, and he didn't just challenge the establishment, he obliterated it. This wasn't a gradual reform or a subtle shift in policy. This was a complete religious revolution that shook the very foundations of one of history's most powerful civilizations. Born as Amenhotep IV around 1380 BCE, this future pharaoh inherited an empire at its absolute peak. Egypt controlled vast territories, gold flowed from Nubian mines, and tribute poured in from conquered lands across the Mediterranean and Africa. The traditional gods, Ra, Amen, Ptah, Isis, and hundreds of others, had blessed Egypt with unprecedented prosperity. The massive temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor stood as monuments to divine favor, their priests wielding enormous political and economic power. Everything was perfect. Everything was stable. Everything was exactly as it had been for generations. And Akhenaten looked at all of this and said, "No, this ends now." What drove a man who had everything to risk it all? The answer lies in understanding just how radical his vision truly was. Akhenaten didn't simply want to add another god to Egypt's already crowded pantheon. He wanted to erase every single deity except one. The Aten, represented as a solar disk whose rays ended in hands, reaching down to touch the earth with life-giving power. But names were just the beginning. This wasn't just religious reform. This was theological genocide. The transformation began almost immediately after his coronation. Within the first few years of his reign, Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten. He ordered the construction of an entirely new capital city, built from scratch in the middle of nowhere in what is now Tel Aviv. This wasn't just moving the capital. This was abandoning Memphis and Thebes, cities that had been centers of Egyptian power for over a millennium. The scale of this undertaking was staggering. Thousands of workers labored to create a city that would serve as the earthly home of the Aten. Massive temples were constructed, but these weren't like the dark, mysterious sanctuaries of traditional Egyptian religion. Akhenaten's temples were open to the sky, allowing the Aten's rays to flood in unobstructed. Royal agents were dispatched throughout Egypt with chisels and hammers, tasked with erasing the names and images of traditional deities from temples, tombs, and monuments. The very architecture was a statement. The old ways of hidden mysteries and priestly secrets were over. The Aten's worship would be conducted in blazing sunlight, visible to all, wherever it appeared, even in Akhenaten's own birth name. It was carved out, leaving scars in the stone that remain visible today. But the real shock came with Akhenaten's systematic campaign against the old gods. Gone were the idealized, formal representations of pharaohs that had dominated Egyptian art for centuries. This wasn't tolerance or coexistence. This was active destruction. The elaborate festivals that had marked the rhythm of Egyptian life were cancelled. The very identity of what it meant to be Egyptian was being rewritten by royal command. Either way, it was a complete break from artistic tradition. Suddenly, royal decree declared that these deities were not just false, they were forbidden. The name of Ammon, the king of the gods, was particularly targeted. The Aten's rays touched them directly, emphasizing that they alone had access to the true God. Imagine the psychological impact on ordinary Egyptians. These weren't just religious symbols being destroyed. These were the gods who had protected Egypt for over 1,000 years. The gods who had made the Nile flood, who had given victory in battle, who had ensured the afterlife for the dead. The priests who had served them for generations found themselves unemployed overnight. The art of Akhenaten's period reflects this revolutionary spirit. Instead, Akhenaten commissioned portraits that showed him with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and a protruding belly. His wife, the famous Nefertiti, was depicted with similar unusual proportions. The traditional priesthood didn't simply disappear. They went underground, maintaining their opposition to Akhenaten's reforms. Foreign allies, accustomed to dealing with a stable Egypt, began to question the reliability of their treaties. Some scholars suggest this was an attempt to show the royal family as they truly appeared, while others believe it represented a new artistic style, meant to emphasize their divine connection to the Aten. The famous bust of Nefertiti, now in Berlin's News Museum, comes from this period and shows the sophisticated artistry that flourished under Akhenaten's patronage. But even more revealing are the intimate family scenes carved in relief, showing Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters relaxing under the rays of the Aten. These images were revolutionary because they showed the royal family as human beings rather than distant, godlike figures. The religious texts from Akhenaten's reign reveal the depth of his theological revolution. It was a level of control that even previous pharaohs, despite their divine status, had never claimed. The great hymn to the Eight, possibly composed by Akhenaten himself, presents a vision of monotheism that wouldn't look out of place in later Jewish, Christian, or Islamic texts. Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, after ruling for approximately 17 years. The old gods were restored, their temples rebuilt, their priests reinstated. Within a few years of his death, the entire religious revolution collapsed. It describes the Aten as the sole creator of all life, the god who makes the Nile flow, who gives breath to all creatures, who watches over all lands and peoples. This wasn't just Egyptian nationalism. This was a universal deity who ruled over all creation. But revolutions, even religious ones, have consequences. The military, dependent on the favor of traditional war gods, grew restless. His name was removed from king lists, his monuments were dismantled, and his capital was left to decay. The famous Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence found at Akkad, reveal a growing crisis, as Egyptian vassals in Syria and Palestine pleaded for military support that never came. Akhenaten was so focused on his religious revolution that he neglected the empire his ancestors had built. The economic impact was equally devastating. The traditional temples weren't just religious centers, they were massive economic institutions that employed thousands of people and controlled vast agricultural estates. By shutting down the old religious system, Akhenaten disrupted the entire economic structure of Egypt. The new capital at Akhetaten required enormous resources to build and maintain, resources that were diverted from other projects throughout the kingdom for 17 years. He made it work through sheer force of will and royal power. Perhaps most tellingly, Akhenaten's revolution was intensely personal. Unlike traditional Egyptian religion, which was administered by professional priests, the worship of the Aten was centered on the royal family. Akhenaten didn't just fight for faith. He fought against an empire. Hit like and subscribe if you want more ancient rebels, lost legends, and the stories that make you go, W-A-I-T. Only here on UTAK Diaries only, Akhenaten and his family could communicate directly with the Aten. Everyone else had to worship through them. This made the pharaoh not just a political ruler, but the sole religious intermediary for the entire kingdom. The end came swiftly. His successor, initially named Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, and move the capital back to Memphis. Akhenaten was abandoned so completely that it became a ghost town, its mud brick buildings slowly crumbling back into the desert. But the most telling sign of how thoroughly Akhenaten's revolution was rejected comes from what happened to his memory. Later, pharaohs didn't just reverse his policies. They tried to erase him from history entirely. For over 3,000 years, Akhenaten was successfully forgotten, known only as the criminal of Akhenaten. In a few surviving texts, it was not until the late 19th century that archaeologists read Akhenaten and began to piece together the story of the pharaoh who had tried to delete the gods. The irony is profound. The man who tried to erase Egypt's religious tradition was himself nearly erased by that same tradition's revenge. Modern scholars continue to debate Akhenaten's motivations and legacy. Was he a visionary monotheist ahead of his time, or a megalomaniacal dictator who nearly destroyed his kingdom? Was his religious revolution genuine spiritual insight or calculated political maneuvering to break the power of the traditional priesthood? The evidence supports elements of both interpretations, making Akhenaten one of history's most complex and controversial figures. What cannot be debated is the sheer audacity of what he attempted. In an age when tradition was sacred and change was dangerous, Akhenaten tried to completely reinvent one of the world's oldest civilizations. He challenged not just political authority but cosmic order itself. But when that power died with him, so did his revolution. He erased gods, rewrote religion, and almost vanished forever. Akhenaten didn't just fight for faith, he fought against an empire. Hit like and subscribe if you want more ancient rebels, lost legends, and the stories that make you go, "Wait. That really happened," only here on UTAK Diaries.